if we just get started, I would like to ask if you have any particular comments to make or anything that you found especially striking about Joe's data. And Ian, shall I start with you on that?
Great talks both, but I guess there's many things to take out of it, obviously, but maybe the onset of when the problems arise is probably something that we weren't truly aware of before. The fact that it could be in utero or so early in their life, and obviously the month and birth being so important, and maybe the lower weight limit. But it's something that we would all understand and realise, but the upper weight limit to the foals and not having huge foals and their propensity to having OCDs was things that are highlighted that we wouldn't know so obviously before. That's it.
Thank you. Anthony?
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Thanks. So, yeah, great talk from Joe there. Huge amount of data. I think certainly my head was spinning by halfway, let alone towards the end. But no, I mean, an enormous amount of work to put all that together, because a lot of what we do, we try and make it less so, but a lot of what we do is anecdotal. And so for me, I do a lot of sales work. I wasn't clever enough to be a stud vet like these learned people. So we've always had the assumption that bigger, heavier animals are more likely to have OCD and more problems, and it's nice to actually put some data behind it at the end of the day. You know, as I say, we've always just kind of assumed that on what we see at the sales and the radiographs we read. So to actually see that we weren't making it up is good. And I think it was, yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more to come out of that as things go on. As everyone I'm sure can see, the problem with it is there's so many factors that feed into it. It's hard to do it unless you've got huge volumes of numbers, which obviously Joe's starting to get, and hopefully you can get more of. I think one of the things I thought was interesting was that the lateral trochlear ridge stuff that you showed, which is certainly a problem in America. I'm sure most people in this room will know there was a pretty famous horse a few years ago that won the Triple Crown that had lateral trochlear ridge surgery and was panned by most American vets, and that didn't work out so well for them. Worked out pretty well for the horse. So there's always got to be very careful, you know, doing those kind of things, because, you know, they will make idiots out of you all the time. But on the flip side of that, you said that the medial femoral condyle lucencies probably weren't connected to the high growth rates and things, which I think that's quite interesting from my side. It's something we see a lot at the sales. It's very problematic, controversial, as Nick says, and you know, the stuff that Liz Sanchi's doing at the moment in America kind of suggests it is traumatic. So you would think that high body weights will be associated with that. So that was pretty interesting for me.
Thank you, Zara.
So I guess I'm sort of very impressed by the huge data set, as Anthony said. I think a lot of papers and things and research that's done over time, the numbers are actually incredibly small, and then sometimes over time that can be shown to be misleading. But I think with these, with Joe's huge numbers, it makes the data much more reliable, basically, and statistically significant. And I think, as Ian and Antony have said, I think that some of it is things that we probably all think, and is how we try to work, but it's actually really nice for once that it is backed up. I am a very big advocate of the weighing of young stock, particularly. My work is the much younger end of the pregnant mares and then the younger foals. And so I think this really shows how we can use our weight monitoring and our regular weighing of foals from an early stage. I thought it was particularly interesting that the lower birth weights were actually quite protective, because I think we all get used to seeing very big foals, and quite often when we're looking at foals, people can be quite critical of the smaller foals, but actually a lot of these smaller foals are within the 44, above 44 kilos. So I think that's quite nice. I think we're probably just getting a bit overused to looking at these very, very big foals, which actually Joe's data shows have a higher chance of OCD. So I think that's very useful to be supported.
Thank you. Matt, be interested to hear what you think, given all the places that you've worked. You can give us a more international perspective a little bit as well as from the UK.
Jesus. I don't know about that, but I think I'd probably start by echoing what Zara and Antony said. It's amazing to have such large numbers. And I think that, as Zara said, our profession really lacks that power in data. And to have that number of foals followed for such a long period of time, to have their x-ray data, their sales data, their racing data, is really impressive amount of work. So I think, huge commendation on that. It's incredible. And I think there's going to be a lot of stuff to be drawn from it. I'm not going to comment on the reproductive stuff because I don't know much about it. And I think that there's more stuff to come. You've worked with Wayne, and I believe he's heading up a group that have another large data set on similar juvenile orthopedic issues coming out. So we've a lot to learn in the next couple of years, I think, which is very exciting.
Nick, we'd love to hear from you.
I echo this. Wayne's McElroy's Kentucky sales survey is going to be a wonderful addition to the information that you have provided today, and that is something we should all look out for. I was fascinated by the level to which first foals were protected against DOD and osteochondrosis particularly. I thought the importance of foal birth rate and the danger of big foals came out very clearly. And I thought that the overall difference between the UK and USA on the relevance of yearling size was also completely fascinating. And just dealing with hock OCD, I'd like Joe to comment at some stage about in this country, I think we look at OCD in the hock and we don't worry about it very much unless the animal has a bog spasm or is lame. My impression in the States is that if it has an OCD in its hock, it gets removed in order to have a clean X-ray at the sales. And I think that our evidence here suggests that having OCD in your hock, if you don't remove it, the majority of them race perfectly well. So I just think that that's worth perhaps a little further discussion about whether you really need the expense of removing a silent OCD from some of these joints. Yeah.
Do you want to cover that off now about?
Yeah,
Joe?
I think all of the veterinary surgeons in Kentucky would agree with what you just said. I think that a lot of it is it's accommodating what the commercial market wants, and they want horses that are clean, and the surgery seems to be very efficacious, so they do it. And I think the breeders have sort of, we better safe than sorry sort of mentality, even if they feel that it's not necessary. But I think you could knock that onto some of the corrective surgeries that are being done. And I think Wayne actually had some great data a long time ago about that, how the lack of necessity of doing a lot of the corrective surgeries, but that's what the market wanted. But I think in your presentation, you mentioned that these things kind of come and go, that there's fads that are in and out. But I think right now, and the folks that do the sales consignment, they want as clean a X-ray as you can get. That anything's going to potentially be something to deduct from the value of the perceived value of the foal. So they say we'll take the economic risk. But I don't know, anybody really that would argue that that all of those are completely necessary.
Okay, I've got some questions here about managing the mares. How should we manage later foaling mares to affect the foal's body weight gains and reduce risks? And I suppose a similar scenario is, should we try and feed more in the slow growth months in December, January and February and less in the high pasture months so that it levels out the growth rates and weight gains to stop rapid growth occurring? How possible is that?
Is that a question for me?
Well, whoever, but yes,
Sure.
I'll direct
Well, I'll
you
start
your way.
with it and then let everyone else kind of chip in. Absolutely. I mean, I think that when you look at the requirements for feed for whether it's a mare or growing horse, they have requirements for a certain number of calories a day. And the horses, if they're getting less calories from pasture, you need to make it up in hard feed. If your goal is to maintain a certain body condition, which you think is best for both the mare, her reproductive success, and the growth of the foal. So there's instances in January and February where you need to feed more feed, and certainly later in the year you need to feed a lot less. I think a lot of breeders don't fine-tune that enough, that there seems to be this continuity of feeding that sometimes they let the grass onset get a little ahead of them and then they realize that this has happened. So absolutely, the question is, when do you change and how much do you change? I think these growth data give us a lot of hints for that. We can see, we know historically when it happens, but it's when you have that odd year, when it happens earlier, it happens late, that you've got to make that kind of judgment. But I think in terms of feeding brood mares, that's the big place we're going to improve, and that is trying to modulate the level of hard feed and late pregnancy to match how they're going to get forage in those different birth months.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've certainly ended up having a very late spring, a cold, dry spring this year. So when the grass did come, it kind of exploded. And I was spending a certain amount of time running around saying to people with their mares they could start easing up because there was so much grass so quickly.
I think in Kentucky for sure that we've got these traditions that you're doing stuff on specific calendar days of the year, whether it's changing the housing when you start leaving them out all the time or bringing them in, that oftentimes is not fine-tuned as much as it should be fine-tuned based on the environmental circumstances for that farm. And I think that's something that if you had enough data to go, oh, whoa, they're starting to gain right now, yeah, we need to not wait a month before we take some action.
Sure.
Would be a definite improvement.
Absolutely. And there's another question which I guess is along the similar lines of how do you see climate change potentially affecting growth curves?
You know, that's interesting. I think it's having a massive effect. And I know that in Kentucky, just over the 30 some odd years, we've seen a very big change in terms of when these seasons occur, and big times when we don't have rain and big times when we have a lot of rain. And I don't think the mindset of the breeders is to be that responsive to that. And I think that really is something that needs to be taken into consideration now. And I've seen it when I spend part of the year in Ocala, Florida, and there was a farm that had a lot of sesamoiditis that occurred. And I went and got the weather data and looked at rainfall over that time, and there was this dearth of rain during the time when we should have had a rainy season then, and they had a big spike of sesamoiditis exactly when that occurred. So I think that there's some of those environmental factors that definitely need to be taken into consideration.
Well, I remember telling you last night that I, a few years ago, mowed my lawn the week before Christmas one year, which my neighbour thought was crazy and came and asked me what I was doing. And then about an hour later, I heard his mower start up, because we seem to be having grass lasting longer into the autumn winter months but sometimes we have to wait for it to arrive in the spring, and I think everybody needs to just be a bit more mindful of that.
Well, the grass was green in February in Kentucky.
Right.
You know, so there was a lot of grass this year, so we'll wait to see what the knock-on effect of that is going to be with this year's crop.
Okay. So if we can just talk about surgical correction of conformation defects, please. Are they likely to contribute to later lamenesses if we've changed the balance of weight bearing on joints? I don't know who wants to start that one. Come on, panel.
You'd like to think that the idea behind improving the conformation is to protect rather than to cause further problems. It's hard to get data on that, but the ones that are towing in, that are having transfascial screws put in, are the ones that end up having knee problems the next year, and there is definitely a saving to the amount of work that you're doing with the farrier and the number that are having fasciitis in well-managed farms by making sure that they're towing out. Like having spent a lot of my time looking over Nick Wingfield Digby's shoulder, looking at young stock, he was always making you aware that these things, like looking after these things towing in, is possibly the biggest thing to look after carefully, and it's been of benefit to be able to keep them out a little bit more and reduce the pressure on the knees when they're a year older.
Okay. Would anyone else like to comment?
So, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at old school textbooks of horsemanship, they spend a lot of time talking about conformation, and there's a reason for that, because if you load a joint evenly, you're going to spread the weight over the cartilage evenly, and it's going to be better in the long term. And so, you know, most of my day is spent in race yards, and there's no doubt that horses with not great conformation are harder to keep sound. However, in the racing side of it, we're using an expression that conformation is a sign of longevity, not ability. So you can have horses with legs on backwards that are winning races, and they can do pretty amazing things. Now, in theory, they may not last as long as a horse with perfect conformation. The perfect conformation one might not be very fast, which is why it lasts even longer. But so conformation is just one of the factors that you've got to put into it. Of course, good conformation is better than bad conformation, but it's not the be-all and end-all, because like all of these things, there are so many other factors that come into play. If you've got a small light filly, which is backed up by Joe's data, you are going to get away with more than if you've got the best part of 600 kilos of colt that's, you know, top heavy and, you know, built like a tank. So it's putting those factors together that allows you to then give an indication, and that's what we're doing at the sales, is of the longevity that horse is going to stay in training, and that then starts to be reflected in the radiographs, because you'll start seeing changes in yearling and potentially even weanling when you vet them at the sales.
Sure. So would there be any particular joint issue or any particular joint itself that would worry you more when you're looking at x-rays of yearlings?
Absolutely. So knees stop horses, stifles can stop horses, pretty much everything else you can deal with.
Anybody else like to comment on that?
Like a lot of the sort of racing papers that looked at racing data, horses are out of training for the most time because of knee and fetlock problems. So trying to get a young horse to have that protective conformation, that athletic conformation, it's not a mistake. It's trying to give that animal the best chance. I'm sure it doesn't affect its ability, but you know, it's all risk mitigation, isn't it?
But I think the thing that we should never lose sight of is that actually we should also, it sounds very obvious, but I come across it quite often, we must also do no harm to the conformation. So it is actually possible through some people's potentially misconceptions, I suppose, to create problems and more stresses and strains on joints. Probably the most common thing that we see is outwardly rotated animals, where if you move, instead of standing in front of the horse, if you move your body, to be in front of the forelimb, in front of the knee, and in front of the fetlock. The horse's conformation is actually fairly correct, but the whole limb is outwardly rotated. But the forelimb, the chest of that horse may be particularly narrow. The forelimb isn't actually attached to anything on the horse apart from the muscle over its shoulder. And those horses, the rotation will improve, and the outward rotation will continue to improve actually its whole life. So when you are looking at foals and you say, well, those limbs will improve, they will come round, people maybe will say, oh, but they didn't. And you say, but you don't look at brood mares that are outwardly rotated. They nearly always end up toeing in. So I think you have to be very careful when people try to correct those types of conformation, that actually then they're putting huge strains on knees and fetlocks, aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay. Matt,
and to take
sorry,
that
Nick.
a little further forward,
Please.
I completely agree with what Zara says there. Towing out tends to be protective for racing. Towing in, we know, increases unsoundness both at the carpal level and at the fetlock level. So the worries that people have about animals that tow out tends to be exaggerated. They really should be left to correct on their own. And I totally support what Zara said then. Yeah.
Matt, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with Zara as well. I'd probably one animal or two animals a year would do something about a towing out or a valgus knee, and those would be very, very severe situations, and generally my back is up against the wall when that happens. But yeah, it's not something that those animals will correct themselves, and as Nick said there, and I think Dr. McElroy's study that's going to come is actually going to show this a little bit, that it's actually protective, so.
And as Joe himself was saying, if we can try and have a preventative way of looking at things instead of just trying to fix it when it's possibly too late.
But also, I'll just comment that the guys that taught me, who have been doing this for, doing what I do now for 30, 40 years, would say that when they started, everything towed out.
Okay.
And I think there's obviously management elements, but I think there's a genetic element
Yes.
to a lot of this that perhaps gets missed sometimes or isn't the focus of some things, because I think we've completely changed the breed, and there's there's every chance that we might change it again.
Okay.
You get a couple of fast horses that tow out, and
Yes. Yeah, people start thinking differently. Absolutely. Just out of curiosity, would you be more forgiving of hind limbs?
yeah, me personally, yes, massively so.
Okay. The rest of you, have you got any particular comment to make on that?
As far as confirmation,
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. As a general rule, they're more forgiving. 60% of the weight of a thoroughbred goes to the front leg. So it's mechanics at
Yep.
the end of the day.
Okay. Okay. Ian, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, foals, absolutely, they can have the most horrific hind limb conformation when they're born, and they're unrecognisable 6 weeks later with minimal management, a lot to do with patience and not too much to do with intervention.
And I suppose that's the other message, is sometimes we do have to be patient and not rush in too quickly.
Yeah.
Have you got any commentary about hind?
Well, I'd say that with hind legs, the only thing that I really worry about is the foal that has the hock that deviates outwards and the pastern that deviates in, and that putting a lateral extension onto the foot of those at a young age can massively transform the rate at which they improve. But as for the weak hocks, the hocks way behind the foal, the slack pasterns, they come right just as long as you don't over-exercise them. Yeah.
And I suppose that's another part of this. I'm worrying about a variety of things in terms of being able to prompt clients accordingly to be feeding appropriately at the right time of year, but exercise and activity is such a big part of it. Can we touch on that a little bit, about how best to try and manage those, say, January born foals when the weather might be horrible? Day length is very short. Are there other ways and other things that we can try and just be thinking about to be sure that we're getting enough activity into those horses versus the May foals that probably are outside a whole lot more?
Can I start
Please.
on that? Well, I think the first thing is the facilities that the stud farm has. You have got to have facilities that allow you to cope with those weather variations and with the winter. So all weather turnout areas, small grass paddocks, areas that you can protect. I mean, foals, unless they have very weak conformation, need to be exercised, but they don't want to be over-exercised. If you over-exercise, they fracture their sesamoids or run into problems. So it's the range of paddock size and paddock facilities that's so crucial for getting through the first 3 weeks of a foal's life. When I first came to Newmarket, very few studs had numbers of nursery paddocks. Now, very few would not have quite a lot, and that has made a colossal difference to the incidence of fractured sesamoids,
Yes.
which we haven't touched on at all today, but of course is a massive thing in relation to sales, particularly forelimb fractured sesamoids. I'm sure other people have got comments to make on that. Yeah.
Whoever would like to jump in, go in.
Yeah, it looks like we have to be slightly protective of the mayfoals, and trying to get that right is something that we maybe should end up concentrating on more, if they're the ones that are going to be more likely to get OCDs, and maybe that by the time they're born we're already behind the curve, and they're the ones that we should be looking after in terms of being careful with the mare's nutrition. But in terms of exercise, I think you have to be willing to change it foal by foal, depending on how upright some of the foals are and how heavy they are, and this ability to have a different regime for individual foals with individual problems does make a difference. This year, quite hard ground, maybe things like pedal bone fractures and stuff like that are things that we're aware of, but you've just got to get your exercise right and try and get your paddock maintenance right where you can, and you obviously can't dictate the type and how hard the ground gets, but do what you can to make these things less of a problem where you can.
I'd like to comment on that. The management, a lot of times we're looking at how much room they have for the foals, and there's no doubt that that's true, and the trend has been towards having small pens and getting, upsizing them as they go. A farm in Kentucky this year did an interesting experiment with their early foaling mares. They, usually in Kentucky you would keep those mares and foals in all night and then out during the day. They started leaving them out at night. These are early ones, but the thing that the farm manager said, which was really interesting to me, was that normally when they do it the other way and they let the mare out, she'll take off running across the paddock and the foal will follow. And now that they're leaving them out, when they let the mare out, she puts her head down and starts to eat. So she doesn't go flying across the paddock with the foal coming behind. The other thing I have to say, of all the years I've known Wayne McElroy, he said one massively profound thing to me. He told me in a lecture that he did for us that sesamoids and young foals, this is the technical term he used, I think, are soft as goose shit. And they fracture very easily when you do that. So that's never left my mind, that when you've got to be protective of that, and so you've got to modify what the mare's doing to help protect those
foal
little
off their
foals.
feet. Yeah.
Yeah, and so a lot of that now is you just put them out in much smaller paddocks, so the mare can't actually go anywhere.
Okay.
I mean, you look at the Australian, the way that their mares are foaled and kept, and they're very rarely boxed, very rarely stabled, and they would foal in a certain size paddock, foal in the foaling paddocks, move to the 9-day paddocks, and they would, as you say, they wouldn't be running every day. They're not being turned out, and I think, as Nick says, those years when we didn't have nursery paddocks in this country and they were keeping their foals like that, a massive observation when you went from one country to the other was that here you were x-raying many foals for sesamoids, fractured sesamoids, as Nick said, and in Australia we just didn't see the fractured sesamoid, so it definitely makes a huge difference. But I think everything is towards keeping the mares calm, and I think if we're feeding very heavily, turning them out in the morning, we're sending an animal flying across a paddock, aren't we? Like Joe says, if we can avoid the extremes, I guess, of exercise, of box rest at night and turn out and charging across a paddock, that's amazing. And it's always great when you can live them, get to the point where you can live them out. It makes a big difference.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to head to the yearling sales now, if I may, momentarily. I know that vendors can find it quite difficult if there's a big variation in how findings in x-rays are reported. Is there anything that any of you feel can be done to sort of improve on that or help with a bit of greater understanding? Are there other ways that we can handle that side of life? Controversial. Go for it, Antony.
Get a different vet. So, yeah, I think there's been a learning curve from both sides, and as Nick touched on earlier, when we started getting digital radiographs. In the old days, we would have a set of x-rays taken on a horse, and they were what we call wet chemistry, so like your old camera films, and we'd be sitting there looking at them on these lights trying to work out what was going on, and if the thing was snapped in half, you could pretty much work that out, but other than that, they were much more limited. We then started getting digital radiograph in the sort of early 2000s, and those have now, as in, it's probably been the biggest change in the veterinary profession and the human medical as well in terms of, imaging. Surgery is surgery, and Matt is very good at it, and, it has changed and it has evolved, but relatively slowly. Imaging has totally transformed in 20 years, a bit like mobile phones have. And what we can do with imaging now in horses and in people is vastly different. So that technology has evolved far quicker than our understanding of it, I think it's fair to say. And
That's a really good point.
we're now looking at things that we didn't even know existed. And is that because they're new and there are problems, or is it because they were always there and we just never knew what they were?
Now you can see them.
I think there was a phase when lots of vets failed lots of horses, most of them probably unfairly. And as a profession, we're probably, we should stick our hands up. I'd like to think I wasn't a huge part of that, but people should admit that they were failing things which were unnecessary. There's been a lot of work now to try and moderate those things, and some of the sales companies have brought in experienced vets that the sales company pays for, and they sit there and try to moderate people's views, and if people aren't familiar with what's going on, then they'll try and help them out and that sort of thing. So there is things being going on. Wayne McElroy, who, for those of you that aren't vets, is sort of like the godfather of orthopaedics, basically, in our world. So he's putting big studies together, trying to, again, put all that data together to show what genuinely is significant and what isn't. So there's been a lot more work in that. You'll probably be pleased to hear that the imaging revolution has probably slowed down now, and I think we've caught up with it, and probably we're in a much better place than we were. And as I said at the beginning, horses like Justify, that is a $50 million mistake. In my job, the worst thing I can do is fail a good horse. I didn't fail Justify because I wasn't there, but it's the absolute cardinal sin, is failing a good horse. Because as far as you've got a willing buyer and a willing seller, and then as a vet, your job is not to get in the way, only to tell them the level of risk. So when you start getting in the way and you say, don't buy that horse because I know better, and $50 million later, you slightly regret your words, and it gets messy. But that is, as I say, that is the cardinal sin in what I do.
Okay. Interesting words, thank you. I'm sure a few people are very happy to hear that. Please, Nick, go ahead.
Well, I think this concept of passing and failing horses at sales vetting is the wrong way of looking at it. Because on the whole, vets don't pass and fail yearlings. They give information to the buyer who decides that they're not going to bid on that horse because of the things that you've told them. But that doesn't mean to say it isn't going to race. It affects its value, and it affects what the future use of the horse might be. Somebody who's buying a racehorse might take a big risk with an OCD or a fractured sesamoid, but would be worried that if they were selling it to Hong Kong later on, that this could interfere with its subsequent sales. So it's not a pass or a fail, it's a risk assessment, and do I want to have that horse or do I want to have a perfect horse? And that comes down to the buyer, not to the vet who's examining the horse. And I think sometimes too much pressure is put on the vet to say you can't buy this horse, because that's clearly not the case in almost every yearling that gets as far as the sales.
But every yearling I've ever bought, I've asked my vet, would you buy it? So.
Yeah, well, of course you have to, but that is an exchange of information between the two people, and it's not. Sometimes when you do a purchase examination, you have to come to a conclusion. There's non-sales purchase, pass or fail it. The sales examination is not that. It's not a complete examination. It's expression of opinion of what you've got in front of you, and you can only do the best you can. Yeah.
We're about to head into our first domestic yearling sale. So the first sale is Arcana in August. Now, if we so much as show the Arcana yearling a young lungering, we'll be terrified of sesamoiditis, and so we don't do that. And 10 days later, we go to Doncaster Premier Sale, where every yearling will be lunged into the ground, and no one seems to give a damn when we get there because there isn't an X-ray machine. Now, I don't have the data in front of me, but I'm pretty confident that the Goff's Premier yearling has more lifetime starts than the Arcana one. How do we address that?
I think that could be based on the type of horse that they're going for, though, isn't it? Like having been to both sales, like you would expect the traditional Donny horse to be more likely to start sooner and therefore run more often. I think exercising yearlings is important, and there's studies that would show that early controlled exercise is actually of benefit to the longevity of the horse, so long as it's done in the right amounts. You definitely don't want to rag the horse to death as a yearling, but controlled exercise, certainly as 2-year-olds, has been shown to increase the longevity of a racehorse rather than decrease it. So that's how I'd say it.
I understand exactly what you're saying, Jamie, and I guess the median price of Arcana sale is going to be significantly higher than Doncaster, so their horses are going to be put under more scrutiny. And is that better or is that worse? There's a reasonable chance, and that's, I guess, what I was trying to say before, is that not every horse with sesamoiditis, when I first started vetting horses down in South Africa, we used to see sesamoiditis all the time, and we barely worried about it. And then people started coming up with the idea of scanning them and this, that, and the other, and getting more and more information. And then we got the better radiographs, and they looked a lot scarier on the new radiographs than they did on the old radiographs. And everyone started to panic about it. And sure, if they do go wrong, they can cause a problem. The majority probably won't, but some do. So if you've paid 500,000 euros in Arcana for a horse and it gets a problem, people get pretty upset. So people do. In theory, when you vet horses, the price shouldn't make any difference, but the reality is that it does. When you're vetting them for millions, you are, this is the honest truth, is you look harder. Simple. So there's an element of it for that. In terms of your question about lunging and this, that, and the other, I mean, there's an argument that the only horses that go around in circles are ones with neurological issues. It's not a natural thing for horses to do, to lunge in any circumstance. You never see it naturally. So should we be lunging horses anyway? Yes, it's a wind test, and that's conditions of sale, and horses in Doncaster that can't lunge both reins in theory are returnable. So, but it's not a natural thing for a horse to do. I don't have the exact answer to where you're at. As Ian says, there is absolutely no doubt that exercise is good for horses, because the earlier they start racing 2-year-olds is safer. It's safer to start racing them as 2-year-olds than it is to start later on, because the body has more powers of adaptation. The guys in New Zealand started looking at actually training foals to see what happened to their ligaments, tendons, etc., etc. And there's an element of truth in that. If you go to watch the Olympics, the gymnasts that win didn't start training at the age of 12. They started at the age of 4. So that's what their bodies are adapted to do. So I'm all for exercise in young horses. Is lunging a great plan? Probably not. Should we be doing it for our carnal horses? Probably not, because at the end of the day, the scrutiny they're under is more than it is for a Doncaster horse.
In Kentucky, it's not so much lunging, but because of the labor situation and whatnot, a lot more of the yearlings are prepped in walkers. And there's a thought that might not be a good thing compared to going straight ahead, because you are loading joints in a non-symmetric fashion. So, the idea of not being able to go straight ahead and having to go in a direction may have a difference in terms of how the joints are loaded. But it's the reality of how you can prep horses today, basically.
We did a sort of internal thing in our practice last year with some of the guys from America looking at stifle cysts, and they're starting to show that cysts in the right stifle are more likely to progress than ones in the left stifle. Now, and that's, again, they've got some pretty good numbers behind it, and it doesn't make sense. You would think that horses should have them equally distributed between left and right. And part of the equation as to why they're doing that is it because they are going around in circles? Number one is one possibility as to why they're doing that. The other possibility, which is a bit left field, is that a bit like people, in that 90% of the population is right-handed, and I think it's about 10% or something like that is left-handed. There may well be some chirality in horses as well, and that they're more likely to take a left or a right lead when they're cruising around paddocks. We don't know, but there is the other, as I say, the going around in circles is one of the possibilities. Most people flip walkers different days, but doesn't always happen. People tend to naturally take horses in certain directions because of the way you lead them always from the left. So we don't know, but circles and horses probably isn't great.
Just to echo on the exercising young horses, I think that, and forgive me if I get this wrong now, but a man called Tim Parkin, who's done a lot of work on racetrack injuries, he's an epidemiologist. He showed actually that horses, national hunt horses that had been previously flat horses, so in training since 2, were far less likely to have breakdown injuries than national hunt horses that were bred to be national hunt horses and started training at 3 or 4, which is kind of counterintuitive, but just goes to show that the body adapts, and once they're adapted, if they stay in work, they're safer.
I think they did quite a lot of work in Japan that supports that, though, as well. So I think that early conditioning has been shown to be has been supported now in really quite a lot of studies, and that short. Ian Wright would always say that short, sharp sprints are chondroprotective. But that probably happens more in a paddock than it does, certainly not on the walker, and it's not short and sharp on the lunge. So it's a mixture.
The 2-year-old question, a study we did with this growth data a while back, we asked the question of horses that start as 2-year-olds, how big are they? And they were horses that were in the smallest quartile started earlier and had significantly more starts. So it's that 2-year-olds help horses stay sound. I think we've got to be a little careful that sound horses start as 2-year-olds. And they're smaller horses, and they tend to stay sounder than big horses. So I think that needs to be thrown into the mix of all the factors that we're trying to put together.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Eileen is over that side of the room if you want the microphone. No? Okay. I've just got a couple more. Is there a significant difference in springtime of the grass nutritional value between day and night? Just thinking about those management of the later, heavier foals and the mares. Please.
There's differences in day and night in fructan concentration, which is more of a fructan is a glucose and a bunch of fructoses put together. It's a complex sugar, but horses can't digest it, so it ends up in the hindgut and it gets fermented. And we worry more about it for laminitis because they can't necessarily digest it. I didn't speak of the composition of the grass, but we did some work in 2000 that looked like horses that had OCD had young horses had some insulin issues, that they produced more insulin to a glucose challenge. So there may be something that could be added into the May and April thing, that they're getting a lot of their caloric intake at that point is non-structural carbohydrates, which may be causing a higher level of sugar and insulin. So it's not necessarily a day or night thing, but it may be a spring versus earlier thing that could be leading to this as well.
Okay. Do any of you have any further comments about the fact that we found more issues with OCD and Mayborn foals? Did you want to talk about anything like that, or any of the other data that Joe shared, if there was anything on there? Because we probably ought to we could talk for hours, but we probably ought to wind it up.
Well, I'll have to say, before we did this, I thought it would be just backwards. I thought it was, like April's the time to have a foal, that would have been a more natural time. We're pushing the birth date earlier. That's artificial. They're kept in more. Oh yeah, it's going to show April's the time. And so I was surprised by their own data, because that is not what I expected. I thought it was going to be the other way around.
Excellent. Has anyone else got anything else they'd like to say? Otherwise, we probably need to crack on. Sorry, heading in your direction, Sarah. Oh, Eileen's there.
Just talking about, Joe pointed out possibly adding some supplements to the foals. It was pointed out that between 0 and 30 days of age can quite affect how the cartilage develops. Is there anything you would suggest?
You should have noticed the big question mark I had at the end of that sentence, because no, I don't know. I mean, if you're trying to put the copper story into perspective, we'd always thought that copper was important because it was involved in collagen formation, but copper can also be involved in vascular integrity as well. And so it may be that some of the supplementation early on would help that, but I would say if that's the case, it should have been fed to the pregnant mare. And Simon Pearce did a PhD in New Zealand a long time ago where he showed that feeding pregnant mares copper was protective against OCD. So I think if we're talking about early supplementation, it may actually be in utero. So I'm not advocating drenching babies with lots of stuff right now, because we just don't know.
Thank you, Joe. Time's ticking, so I think we probably ought to wind up, but I just have one more question for everybody. Would you mind just putting up a show of hands if you weigh or measure your young stock, please? Just, it's interesting to understand what proportion of people do. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Well done. I'm so happy that you do that. Thank you very much to all the panel. Wise words, as ever. That was what we wanted, a little bit of everything in there without any particular one topic getting heavily involved. So we appreciate the skill set that you've brought and the opinions and views that you've shared. Thank you. Round of applause, please.